from Nour Odeh. She is a former spokesperson of the Palestinian Authority, and she joins us live now from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program. Let me first get your thoughts on the revival of the negotiations. Will it result in a permanent ceasefire?
It doesn't look like this round of negotiations will lead to a ceasefire. I think we can look forward to negotiations that could possibly produce a prolonged ceasefire that perhaps the Americans and the Israelis would prefer to call a humanitarian ceasefire. But it would be a partial agreement, an agreement that would end this war would require a lot more, including a political framework. And at this point, it doesn't seem like there is enough international pressure on Israel to abandon its plans to completely destroy Gaza, to possibly expel its population outside of Gaza, and to occupy parts of the north and the eastern borders as so-called buffer zones. So there's still a lot, I think, of gaps in the international efforts to contain Israeli ambitions of expanding its territory into Gaza.
We'll get into the ambitions in a bit, but how much pressure do you think is on the U.S. now, particularly at the UN, for yet another draft calling for a ceasefire?
I think the Biden administration finds itself in a very awkward position of confronting the entire international community. And this is embarrassing for it, and it will affect its interests in not just in the region, but in the world at large. It's also embarrassing for the American president, who will need his constituents in the coming year to win re-election. And as far as we know, in the polls, 56% of all Americans from all political affiliations oppose the Biden administration's policies and want a ceasefire. The absolute majority of the Democratic Party wants a ceasefire, and yet he is committed to an outdated playbook, if you will, of blind support for Israel, of complete disregard for Palestinians, for Palestinian rights, for Palestinian lives, and certainly for the opinion of Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim Americans, which he's finding out would be very costly for him come next November.
Nour, absolutely nothing can justify the death and destruction that Israel has caused in Gaza today, not the October 7 attacks, not the hostages, none of it. What do you think Israel's endgame is here? And I want to also ask you what the PEA's thoughts are on this obsession with holding talks on a post-conflict Gaza that is mostly being led by the U.S. when the war on Gaza is still very much ongoing.
Well, thank you for those questions, because I think they're very important. I think the Israeli intention for this war are two or three things. One is absolute complete destruction of the Gaza Strip. And we heard the Israeli officials promising that. They said they would turn Gaza into a city of tents. They would take it back to the prehistoric age. They would expel its population and so on. And they're doing that very methodically and very systematically. Another goal, I think, for the Israelis would be to expel as many Palestinians as possible, in addition, of course, to killing the tens of thousands. We've already seen them do that, but to expel as much as possible of the population in what the Israeli cabinet is calling thinning out the population. And these are, things mentioned in the Israeli media. These are not speculations. The preferred scenario, in my opinion, for Benjamin Netanyahu, it would be for this war to draw out so that he could stay in power, and for Palestinians to leave to the sea, to the Sinai. He really doesn't care much. And he also wants to make sure that Palestinians do not unite. So he doesn't want to see a united Palestinian political system, because that would mean that Israel would face possibly some international pressure to actually talk about ending the occupation, which is something that he has continuously boasted that he has prevented all those years that he's been prime minister. This is a man who's opposed to the very idea that Palestinians have rights, let alone to any willingness to sit down and talk about ending this colonial settler colonial enterprise that they have in the West Bank and Gaza.
Right.
And for the PA, this is very awkward. I think that a lot of the talk about the post-war, the day after Gaza, is a distraction meant to
Hmm.
take away and deflect the attention from the crimes that are happening on the ground, but also highlighting the American style that we've seen since the beginning of this war, very unilateral, very lacking in transparency, and really quite arrogant in thinking that in Tel Aviv and Washington, they can draw up a plan, decide for the Palestinians who can lead them and how,
Hmm.
and simply hand out the paper and everybody will follow suit. And it hasn't worked in the past, and I am quite certain that it wouldn't happen now, especially that the American thinking it seems to be in the direction that this war would somehow end the existence of a group like Hamas or Islamic Jihad, who are
Hmm.
part of the social fabric and political scene and will
Okay.
continue to be even after this war is over, and no matter how it is over.
All right, Nour Odeh. Unfortunately, this is all the time I have left, but thank you so much for being with us here on the News Hour.